So in this video, we're going to talk about pornography addiction and how it particularly relates to men in pornography addiction. So to kind of kick us off, I've found a quotation by Andrew Huberman that really, I think, sort of kicks off this conversation in a healthy way. So I'm going to just read that quotation. We'll kind of dive into what that means. So Andrew Huberman's short quotation is, "One of the absolutely pathologic situations for any animal or human is to be able to access repeated dopamine surges without effort or pursuit." Now, what I think Andrew Huberman is sort of articulating in this quotation is in regards to pornography. Pornography is sort of that ability to receive dopamine surges whenever or like instantly inside of the dopaminergic system within our brain. And the reason that that is an important idea to understand is because pornography becomes a crutch in our life that our brain finds a way to instantly activate our dopamine systems. And the reason that's so important to understand is in the context of how our dopamine pathways work within our brains. So dopamine, as you may know, is a chemical that basically helps us with our reward and motivation in daily life. So it takes a certain amount of dopamine to wake up in the morning. It takes a certain amount of dopamine to make your bed. It takes a certain amount of dopamine to go out and to do things that maybe we don't want to do, but we know that will provide a dopamine hit later on, like working out or maybe working on a business or doing something that requires a delay of gratification. Now, our brain is primed to find dopamine. And as our brain is still evolutionarily created to very similarly to how our ancestors lived in terms of no screens, no technology that we have today, the dopamine receptors are actually very sensitive in their primal state. So for instance, things like sugar, things like watching a screen, like those light up our brain in ways that are completely just full of dopamine. And because of this, we get attracted to these very easily, as can be seen with phone addiction and sugar addiction. And particularly what we're talking about here is pornography addiction. And Jordan Peterson actually has a quote that I think is really powerful to articulate this as well. And this is just paraphrasing, but basically he says that today, a man in one afternoon can see more naked women than a man in the 1800s would have seen in his entire life. And the reason that that is important is to understand is because our brains are not evolutionarily designed to see pornography at the rate that it is consumed today. And when I'm speaking about this, I'm not speaking about this in terms of a moral context. I'm not talking about whether or not pornography is good or bad or right or wrong morally. I'm just talking about the effects that it has on our brain and why I think watching pornography is unhealthy from a biological standpoint. This has nothing to do with healing from sexual trauma or experiencing sexual liberation or freedom. I'm not making a counter argument or argument in that realm. I'm just specifically talking to how our brain is affected by dopamine and specifically with pornography. And when we are watching pornography, what happens in our brain is that our brain goes into this state where it believes that it is procreating. And because procreation or producing more of our species is one of the main driving forces behind our psyches, when our brain is convinced either through actual or artificial means that it is getting laid, then basically it says whatever we're doing in our life must be okay. And so if we're, smoking pot, sleeping in way too late in the mornings, not really feeling driven throughout our days, not really working out, eating unhealthy, but we're still going out and watching pornography and getting that huge surge of dopamine, we're actually tricking our brain into thinking that what we're doing is okay because we're receiving the dopamine required for our brain to feel safe. And so we're sort of caught in this comfort loop, in this cycle of seeking comfort through pornography. And so because we've convinced our brain that in watching pornography we're having sex, our brain says that whatever we must be doing must be okay. And so we get stuck in these cycles of unhealthy habit cycles where life can sort of become meaningless and dull, and we sort of become like rats in a cage just seeking that pornography. Now, addiction itself is an extremely complex subject, but to sort of just break it down into some more just easier terms for us to understand and kind of start building a little framework around it. Something about addiction is that it is completely personal to each individual. Everybody's addiction is unique to themselves. However, addiction as an archetype or addiction as an overall theme has patterns in it that we can recognize. And one of these patterns is this desire or this need for connection. And that is what typically is happening within watching pornography, is that there is some sort of need for connection or intimacy that is being met. And we could go into depths and details about perhaps how this connection to intimacy is sort of like this mythic idea of like connecting with something divine, or almost connecting with like this idea of the feminine, whether or not we're watching pornography in a homosexual or in a heterosexual context. There is sort of this seeking of other, seeking of connection in a way. And what's interesting about this idea is that what we are doing is we are artificially connecting to an aspect inherent in our brain that is seeking the divine in some way, or that is seeking a connection to something greater than itself. In our brains, we have a natural proclivity to connect with something, a larger story than ourselves, or something greater than ourselves, whether you call it a higher power or God or spirit or creator or nature. It doesn't really matter. Our brain has a proclivity to connect to something like that. And when it doesn't do so in a healthy way, the brain still seeks that in unconscious ways. And one of the ways in which it goes about doing that is through pornography. Now, even though each addiction is completely unique, another common theme that shows up within pornography is actually loneliness. This happens with a lot of pornography addicts, is that there's an overall sense of loneliness that is accompanied with a pornography addiction. And these feelings of loneliness are typically satisfied through immediate instant gratification when it comes to pornography. And I think that that's really important to understand, because there is almost a self-perpetuating cycle of that loneliness that exists, where the loneliness is a precursor to then watch the pornography. And if the brain knows that it needs to watch pornography in order to get that hit of dopamine, it will actually put itself into unhealthy situations of isolation and situations away from others. And so what this basically means on the reversal side of this is that a really good way to work with pornography addiction is to connect. And connection can basically come in two different forms. One form of connection can be through, like I mentioned, a higher power, or a connection to something greater than oneself, or a connection through meditation, or just sitting in stillness. Whatever that connection is to something spiritual in one's life, something that gives one meaning, that's a form of connection that we seek. And another form of connection is through community, and is through being with other people. And ultimately, that's what I believe that we're seeking in connection through pornography, is connection to other people. And we're attempting to go about intimacy in a way that is particularly unhealthy, or allows us to achieve a false sense of intimacy without actually having to work with another human being. And there's a dance that occurs inside of a human being when we do work in that way that I think is extremely important to understand. And I think that when we watch pornography, it is slowly deteriorating our brain. And I do think that there's an aspect of following through with a pornography addiction that eventually would lead to suicidal ideation or death in some way. And so I don't think that pornography addiction should be taken as something very light. And if you're struggling in pornography addiction right now, you may currently be in that grip of that addiction, and understanding exactly how miserable that can be. And if you are currently working with addiction, a really good resource is actually Sex Addicts Anonymous, or Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. And even if you don't identify as an addict, I think it's an extremely healthy space to go to as a resource, to at least connect with those two things, to connect with that spiritual power, and also to connect with a community and a fellowship, and to feel seen and to understood, and to work with people who are working through similar problems as yourself. And something that's great about the 12-step community is that people who go to 12-step get to recognize that they are a part of something that other people are also experiencing, and they no longer feel alone. And that's a huge part of that addiction, is the isolation in that. And so just speaking to how you can find that connection is through these 12-step communities and working that program. So if you are currently going through an addiction, I'm just sending you some love and hope you're doing well. And just, yeah, know that there is help out there. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Bye.